In 1990, the Des Moines Register wrote, when Edouard Izac died earlier this year, few remembered the Iowa native, nor knew that he was a hero of his country. It seems that all too often we forget our heroes nearly as quickly as they rise. Time moves on. But there was a particular poignancy in the passing of Edouard Izac in 1990. The nearly 100-year-old Navy veteran had been the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the First World War.
Secretary of the Navy Joe Daniels wrote in 1919, "The chief byproduct of the Great War is the revelation made to this generation that we associate every day with men of heroic mold. Before the call to battle came, we had not the vision to see the stuff of which American youngsters were made." One such American was Edouard Victor Michael Izac. Born in Iowa, his father made farm wagons. His father had immigrated from a German-speaking part of Alsace, France, and his mother was the daughter of immigrants from the Baden-Württemberg region of Germany. Edouard grew up speaking German at home and also learned French. His ability with language would serve him later on. On his entry into the U.S., U.S. immigration officials had changed Edouard's father's name from Isaac, I-Z-A-C, to Isaacs, I-S-A-A-C-S. Successful in school, the youngest of 9 children had little prospect for college, and so decided to try to attend the U.S. Naval Academy. But there was a problem. The Congressional Medal of Honor Society explains. His father, however, an outspoken Democrat, alienated the Republican congressman who would appoint candidates to the Academy, and thus put an end to this possibility. He solved the problem by going to live with his brother in Illinois, where a Chicago Democratic politician sponsored his entry into the Academy. On May 6, 1911, he was appointed as a midshipman 4th class in the Naval Academy. The Naval Academy yearbook, which is called the Lucky Bag, said of him, "He has the most delightful and remarkable ability to keep his mouth shut unless he has something to say. But when he do talk, break out the dictionary." The yearbook also notes a little stubbornness also will be noted in the analysis of his character. That trait would also serve him later on. After graduation, he served on the battleships Kansas and Florida. In mid-1917, he was promoted to lieutenant junior grade and assigned to the USS President Lincoln. The 18,084 gross registered ton passenger liner had been built in Belfast by the firm Harland and Wolff and named Scotian. Sold to the German-owned Hamburg American Line, the ship was renamed Berlin and later renamed President Lincoln. The Spokane Chronicle reported in 1907 that the ship was the twin of the President Grant, had cabins to accommodate 4,000 passengers, and can race through the sea at the speed of 20 miles an hour. On August 4, 1914, the ship arrived in New York from its regular route, but while the ship had been at sea, England and France had declared war on Germany, and upon docking in New York, the ship was interned under international laws of neutrality. The Hague Convention allows neutral nations to hold ships of belligerent nations in a safe place to prevent their being used in war. The crew was given the option of applying for U.S. immigration papers or being sent to an internment camp, although enough were allowed to remain on board to maintain the vessel. When the U.S. entered the war in April of 1917, the ship was seized and turned over to the U.S. Shipping Board, which retained the name President Lincoln. Her crew, however, were given orders to render the ship unusable and did significant damage to the ship's engines and mechanical systems. Lieutenant Isaacs helped to finish repairing and fitting out the vessel as a troop transport, including the installation of 4 6-inch naval guns. The ship was commissioned into the Navy on July 25, 1917. Isaacs later wrote, "When I was ordered to the President Lincoln from the fleet and realized that I would actually have an opportunity to do my share in the winning of the war, I was pleased beyond description. I rather expected to be wounded or killed or even drowned, for I conjectured that if the game went on long enough, it was only natural that, by the laws of choice and chance, the Lincoln would finally be torpedoed." According to the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command, the ship embarked as a troopship for the first time on October 19, 1917, carrying a crew of 430 and 4,669 troops of the American Expeditionary Force to France. Isaacs remained on the crew for 5 transatlantic crossings, bringing more than 22,000 troops safely to France. By May of 1918, he had been promoted to lieutenant and was the ship's first officer. The ship embarked 4,625 troops at Brest on May 23rd. The President Lincoln, captained by Commander P.W. Foote, began the return trip east on May 29th. A Colonel Clopton was in charge of the Army troops on board. He was quoted in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute Press in 1922. "We left Brest, France, about dark on May 29th in company with 3 other naval transports. the Susquehanna, the Antigone, and the Rinjam. We were escorted by American and French destroyers until dark on May 30th, when these boats left us to join a large convoy of ships bound for France. We hoped to pass safely through the remaining part of the war zone under the cover of darkness of that night. As the destroyers, one by one, disappeared into the darkness, we took up the duties of an added vigil, for we had on board many wounded heroes going back to God's country to regain their strength, and the long night watches need to be kept with diligence until we had passed safely through the remainder of the war zone. We trusted to the darkness, and as an added measure of safety, for on the morrow we will be clear of the U-boat's hunting ground. The morning of May 31st broke fine and clear. The sun showed brightly as we were then in about longitude 17 degrees west and about 500 miles from the coast of France. We felt that the worst dangers of another voyage through the war zone were over, and that New York and home were only a little way before us. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes, on the morning of 31 May at 8:57 a.m., the convoy was attacked. 3 torpedoes crossed the bow of Rinjam and plunged into President Lincoln's port side, 2 forward near the bridge and the 3rd after the engine room. Though the stricken vessel settled rapidly, she wirelessed her position. It was soon evident to the captain that she was doomed, and though the ship's guns were manned in the hope that the U-90 would show herself, Captain Foote ordered the ship to be abandoned. Clopton reported, "The discipline was perfect. With everyone at his station, I ordered the boats lowered. The ship settled gradually, nearly on an even keel, listed a little to starboard, and down a little by the stern. It was hard to realize that she was actually sinking before our eyes and that we could do nothing to save her. It had been about 30 minutes from the time she was struck till the ship sank." Isaacs wrote, "At 9:30 we were well clear, and the old ship, turning over gently to starboard, put her nose in the air and went down. As the waters closed over her, we rose and gave 3 cheers to the President Lincoln, the best ship that ever carried troops in the cause of freedom." 23 enlisted men and 3 officers were killed in the sinking, but the rest of the crew and Army passengers managed to safely abandon ship. After sinking, the crew brought the 12 lifeboats together, lashing them together so as to not get separated. But then they sighted what Clopton said appeared to be a small sailboat approaching. But we knew this could not be, and that it was the enemy's submarine, returning to look us over and probably take some prisoners. It was really hard to realize that we were at last to look the enemy in the face, but it was a bitter thing to know that we could no longer contend with him, and were practically at his mercy. Isaac's story was later reported in the Cresco, Iowa Times. When the President Lincoln went to the bottom of the ocean, Lieutenant Isaacs climbed up on a raft. Soon afterwards, the submarine emerged, and their commander demanded the captain of the President Lincoln as a prisoner. Isaacs told him he believed the captain had gone down with the ship, not as he was aware of that, but to save, if possible, the captain being taken prisoner. While this was going on, Lieutenant Isaacs said he lay on the raft with his arms under him to hide the officer's stripes under his uniform, but without success, and he was ordered aboard the submarine. Clopton reported, when Isaacs was called from the boat, he said to his men, "Goodbye, men, it's all in the game." Isaac wrote later, "I grasped the hands of those nearest to me in a heartfelt goodbye, and jumped on the deck of the submarine." Captain Foote was very much alive, but Isaacs endeavored to convince the German captain otherwise, as it was his duty to remain with his men and so be in a position to look after their safety until aided by rescuing vessels. Clopton reported, "In the blackness and silence of the night, with the slap of the waves against the boats as we drifted before the wind, it was a time to try our courage and cheerfulness, and the light from our little flare-up torches seemed so futile in its effort to penetrate the blanket of darkness which covered the ocean. There suddenly appeared in that wall of darkness a blinking white light. There was no mistaking the light, and I thought of the Star of Bethlehem. The light flashed a few times, and then darkness again. The enemy's submarine may be lying in wait for the rescue ship. Then a megaphone calls from the darkness, 'Who's there?' And I reply, 'The crew of the President Lincoln.' The light came from the destroyer, USS Warrington. The destroyers Warrington and Smith were able to rescue all the survivors, except for, of course, Isaacs. Clopton said of him, 'This cheerful spirit of Isaacs was characteristic of the entire ship's company, but the later experiences of Isaacs were to put his spirit to a severe test.' Isaacs wrote, 'The more I thought about it, the less I liked it. The only one taken among the 700 souls on the President Lincoln. Worse still, the only United States Navy officer captured by the Germans during the war.' The next day, the submarine was sighted by the Warrington, which dropped 50 depth charges. Isaac wrote, 'We ran at depth and 200 feet. All officers and men were at their stations. I was alone in the wardroom with no companions but hope and fear. Hope that they would get the submarine, and fear of that very eventuality.' The Warrington saw no evidence they had damaged the U-boat, but Isaacs reported that it was shaken from stem to stern. Having survived attack by his own Navy, Isaacs began to discover all that he could about the submarine. The officers, he said, mostly spoke English and treated him well, but he didn't let them know that he spoke German. The Navy Times wrote, had they known Isaac understood all they were saying, they would have spoken less freely. Isaac made many observations about the submarine, its operations, its path returning to Germany, even about an island the boat used to catch fresh mutton. They captured a lamb, and he wrote, we named it Rona. From that time on, Rona and I, being companions in misery, were the best of friends. But Isaacs, having learned what he felt was vital information, was focused on escape. He wrote, many times during my stay on board the submarine, I had planned to escape. I racked my brain for ideas. He resolved to jump off the submarine one night as it approached darkness, but was stopped by the captain. It was the first of many escape attempts. He found out that the relatively friendly treatment aboard the submarine had un-German character. Once they reached port, he was treated more harshly, and given food we should have been ashamed to feed an animal. Interrogated, he wrote, I rather frightened him with tales I told of the 2 million men we had in France and the 20 million more who were on the way, until finally he lost his temper. He was surprised by German propaganda, which had, among other things, convinced his captors that the U.S. was going to enter the war on Germany's side. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp in Karlsruhe. Still intent on escaping, he collected what he could and was given a map and compass by some other prisoners. An escape plan was foiled when a guard who had been bribed was discovered. Another attempt was foiled a few days later when guards had gotten too close as he and another officer were trying to cross the wire. Being sent to another camp at Villingen, he tried jumping from a fast-moving train. He injured both his knees and was knocked senseless when his head struck a rail. Struggling to his feet, he wrote, had it not been for the condition of my knees, I should have been able to make my escape. But by the time I was on my feet, trying to shuffle away, the guards had descended from the train. He tried to surrender, but with fiendish fury, the first guard, turning his gun in for in and grasping it by the muzzle, rushed on me and dealt me a smashing blow on the head. When I came to my senses, I was lying in a shallow ditch at the foot of the hill, and the guards were cursing and kicking me and trying to make me get up. One struck me with a rifle so hard that I was knocked several feet away. The gun broke in two at the small of the stock, and for several days I was totally deaf in the left ear. They forced him to walk 5 miles to camp. He wrote, I refused to die. Locked in solitary confinement for 3 weeks, he lost 30 pounds. But he still had his stubborn streak. He wrote, with almost my first breath of fresh air, I vowed that I would surely escape the next time. He slowly regained strength and made more plans. Another plan was foiled when the guards built a new fence. Yet another was foiled when a Russian officer escaped, prompting a search of the camp, finding his hoarded supplies. Finally, on October 6th, he helped to engineer a mass escape of 70 American officers. Compatriots in the camp used jury-rigged chains to short out the uninsulated electricity wires, plunging the camp into darkness. The Russian prisoners engineered a distraction, and he used a ladder they had constructed to get past the wire. Several others used different methods to cross the wire in teams. With another American named Willis, who had been captured while serving with the French Air Force, he marched over hills, through rivers, and into swamps. They had hoarded some pepper, which they used to distract the dogs tracking them. They ate raw vegetables they stole from fields. On the 7th day, they reached the Rhine and tried to swim across to Switzerland. Swimming the river was exhausting, and he finally knew he couldn't make it. He wrote, I could go no further, so turning over on my back, I commended my soul to God and closed my eyes. Instantly, my feet touched the rocks. He made it to neutral Switzerland on October 13th. He turned himself in to Swiss authorities, and from there was able to find Willis, who had also survived the swim. Only one other officer from the mass escape had made it. They were taken to the U.S. Embassy in Bern, given the necessary papers, and made it back to France. He then proceeded to London, finally reaching the U.S. Naval Commander Admiral William Sims, prepared to give his important intelligence gathering on German submarine operations. He arrived there on October 23rd, and that day the German fleet mutinied in Kiel. He wrote, the day after my report was submitted, it was learned that the German submarines were turning to their home ports under the white flag. I was too late. He arrived back in the United States on November 11th. Armistice Day. He told a newspaper that the only treatment given him that even resembled decency was on the submarine, and that was nothing for them to be proud of. In 1919, he published his extraordinary memoir, Prisoner of the U-90. He was promoted to lieutenant commander and awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation reads, during his stay on the U-90, he obtained information of the movements of German submarines, which was so important that he was determined to escape, with a view of making his information available to the U.S. and Allied naval authorities. The award was presented to him by the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt. Navy Secretary Daniels said that his exploits will live in the annals of naval daring and disregard of danger. Forced to retire owing to his injuries, he moved to San Diego, where his wife's family lived. He worked in newspapers, lived briefly in France, where upon researching his family history, he decided to change his name back to the original spelling, Izac. He returned to San Diego and, at the urging of veterans group, ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1931. He ran again in 1936 and was elected. He served 5 terms. He advocated for veterans' causes.
After losing re-election in 1947, he moved to a farm that he had inherited in Virginia and lived the life of a gentleman farmer, eventually writing a book about his visits to Israel. His 99th birthday was noted by Willard Scott on the Today Show in 1989. By then, he was already the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Great War. He died of heart failure in 1990, survived by 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and 25 great-grandchildren, having lived a life of what Colonel Clopton called most thrilling and daring exploits. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop and book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.